I have a friend. He's a very lucky person. You see, somewhat early on in his adulthood, he found his place in the world. He found where he wants to be. And that place is Japan. There's something about Japan that absolutely syncs with him somehow. The culture, the history, every part of his senses seems to be invigorated by Japan. He's lived there several occasions, and he tends to visit quite often. And the reason that this is lucky is because he knows that Japan is where he wants to be. About a year and a half ago, I had a small crisis. I wouldn't really call it a crisis, but it was just a bit of a reckoning. I asked myself, where is my place in the world? Do I have one? Is there a geographical specific location that I would be able to say, I belong here? And I don't know if I have one. I'm very unsure. But the closest I've come is Mexico. It's 1:47 a.m. on November 2nd. I'm on a boat with a bunch of other tourists, some Mexican, some not Mexican. And I'm on my way to the island of Bacanda, in the middle of Lake Pátzcuaro. Pátzcuaro itself is a town in the central Mexican state of Michoacán. I'm soaked to the bone. It has been raining since 6 in the evening, and my shoes are not the best shoes to have. They have holes in them, and my feet have been wet for absolute hours. Somehow, dog shit from a stray dog, most likely, that had eaten nothing but garbage for the last week, perhaps all of its life, is smeared all the way up my left pant leg. I've smelt like dog feces for the last 3 hours. And this boat, as it's plugging along, is nice enough. I'm absolutely freezing. We're headed to the island of Bacanda to visit a cemetery. At this point, I have mainly spent my evening sitting in a bus with about 20 other tourists. We're heading around to visit cemeteries for the Day of the Dead. The trip hasn't been a very enjoyable one. Again, the rain, and there's been a ton of crowds, and there's been traffic. And I'm sitting here on a lake with people all around me. And I'm wondering, how the hell did I get here? My name is Douglas Batchelor, and you're listening to What Magic Is This? I fell in love with Mexico fairly easily. When I was somewhat young, maybe 10, 11 years old, my parents took me on a trip to Cancun in the Yucatan Peninsula. We did the normal touristy things while we were there, the beaches and the restaurants, but my parents decided to do something interesting because they knew that I liked Indiana Jones and that kind of thing. They took me to the ancient Mayan ruins of Tulum, which might have been called Zama, which means City of Dawn, because the sunrises there are apparently unbelievable. But this stirred something within me. I absolutely loved it, and I think my brother did too. In fact, my brother has spent quite a bit of time in Mexico, and it's part of his PhD thesis. So apparently my parents did a very important thing for my brother and I. Years later, we took another trip to Cancun, and this time we visited Chichen Itza, probably the most notorious Mayan ruins that you can visit. But this trip, I came prepared. I was somewhat obsessed from my first visit to Mexico, and so I read up about Mayan culture and mythology as much as possible. The ruins themselves were, well, it's Chichen Itza. I absolutely loved it. I loved everything about it. In fact, I was that precocious child that, well, we took a tour with a tour guide, and he was explaining things about Chichen Itza and the ruins themselves and the Mayans. And at one point he mentioned that Chichen Itza's pyramid was the tallest pyramid within the ancient Mayan civilization. And I had to correct him, and I said, no, it was actually in Tikal in Guatemala that has the highest pyramids. Well, that's actually wrong as well. It's actually El Mirador in Guatemala. Anyways, I'm digressing here a little bit, but that love, it just stayed kindled from these two visits to Mexico, and I came back home with the obsession still well fired, well maintained. And later on in my teens, there was a computer game that was released called Grim Fandango. The setting for this video game was based around the Mexican Dia de los Muertos, or the Day of the Dead. Again, adding some more kindling to the fire. The Day of the Dead was always one of those things that I've wanted to see, I wanted to experience. When I was about 20 years old, my parents, they separated, and my mother decided that she wanted to lead a different life, so she decided that she wanted to teach English as a second language. The place that she decided to situate herself for this would be in the Mexican city of Morelia in Michoacan. This was an absolute blessing. For as long as she lived there, I would go down for at least a period of 2 weeks to the city of Morelia, continuing this obsession that I have with Mexico. This year, 2019, my mother decided that her time in Mexico was coming to an end, and that she was going to move back to Canada for the rest of her life. And this made me very sad, for somewhat obvious reasons. But back in February, I decided this is the year I will go and I will experience Dia de los Muertos for myself. So what is Dia de los Muertos, or what is the Day of the Dead? For those who have no idea, Day of the Dead is a holiday observed throughout Mexico on November 1st, which is All Saints' Day, and November 2nd, which is All Souls' Day within a lot of Catholic countries. On November 2nd, that is Day of the Dead. One thing it is not is Mexican Halloween. Get that idea out of your head right now. That's the one and only time I will mention that word. It is not Halloween. Variations as to how the holiday is observed depends on which area of Mexico you find yourself in. People forget, geographically, Mexico is quite large and diverse. And until somewhat recently historically, traveling in Mexico was very difficult, so regional variation has been maintained, thankfully. Speaking broadly, there are no universals. It hinges itself around ancestor veneration. Many Mexicans will visit their ancestors' family members and friends where their remains are at rest. They will clean up these graves. They will decorate it with flowers, mainly marigolds, which are just beautiful and orange. They'll have candles put on in the graveyard, food, alcohol, water, things that their dead enjoyed. Many people will sit around these graves and sing songs. They'll play guitar, they'll say prayers, they'll talk to each other, they'll even talk to the deceased as if they're still there. It is not a morbid celebration in any way. In many respects, Day of the Dead is about life through a lens of mortal existence. In many parts of Mexico, there will be festivals, there'll be parades, there'll be costumes, there'll be candy, there's pan de muertos, which is bread. There'll be arts, there'll be crafts, and including those sugar skulls that you would normally see equated with Mexico, that's from Day of the Dead. And one thing, it's not until only recently that the Catrinas, which are the skeletal figures that are dressed like those who are alive, have been associated with Dia de los Muertos. Perhaps as recently as 15 years, according to a few Mexicans that I talked with. But veneration and respect are the order of the day on November 2nd. It is not spooky, it is joyous, and I fucking love it. I think that they've been getting it right for a long, long time in Mexico. Death and Mexico. Mexico and death. The attitude towards death in Mexico is a very, maybe not problematic one, but complex one. Figures of skeletons and skulls. The question is asked whether or not that these are the totems of Mexico. I asked my Mexican friend what the totem of Mexico would be. In Canada, it would probably be, I don't know, a jar of maple syrup or a hockey stick or some such thing. He said for Mexico, it would be the chili pepper. When I asked him, not a skull or a skeleton, he laughed and he said, maybe for the tourists, yes, in a sly way. But perhaps he's right. Ask a Mexican what the national attitude towards death is, and you will get a different answer each time you ask and each different person that you ask. Tales of ancient cultures within Mexico, such as the Toltecs, the Mayans, and the Aztecs with their human sacrifices. Perhaps besides the pyramids, the one thing that everybody knows about these cultures, it would be a huge disservice to say that Mexicans have always loved death. The history of Mexico is incredible. The ancient civilizations, Spanish conquest and colonialism, the Inquisition, 2 revolutions, NAFTA, the war on drugs, and on and on. All of these have played a part regarding the idea of mortality within this splendidly complex country, one which figured that it should have been an imperial power itself at some point. Is death something special in Mexico? Special? Perhaps. Probably. Do they view it differently than everybody else? Again, perhaps. Probably. It's amazingly complex. As much as I'd like to give you a spot-on analysis of these ideas, there isn't enough hours in the day, let alone in a podcast episode to fully flesh it out. I recently read a book called Death and the Idea of Mexico, which is a tour de force book by Chilean professor of anthropology at Columbia University, Claudio Lomnitz. I fear that I am no closer to an answer than I ever was. I can merely echo the sentiment I have stated many times in previous episodes. It's never only one thing. To say that Mexicans have always been obsessed with death is a glib statement. It's much, much more interesting. I can merely suggest reading that book, Death and the Idea of Mexico, as I did, to get some semblance of an idea. And I have to thank Dr. R. Andrew Chestnut, the author of Devoted to Death, for suggesting that book. Devoted to Death is probably the greatest book written about the new religious movement of Santa Muerte, or Saint Death. So that's another book that you guys should read. It's just spectacular. Even using the comparative asset I talked about in the previous episode, all I can say is that death in Mexico is certainly part of its overall nationalism and everything that it entails. Mexico is fiercely proud of itself, and with the notion of people that have been constantly punished somehow in every century for generations. Ancestry and death seem important because they have to be. It is a story that is being written every year, and I love it. Its ugliness, its beauty, and more than anything, its complexity. So, how did it all come about? The history of Dia de los Muertos has no singular point where we can say a champagne bottle was smashed on its hull. Again, ritual human sacrifice was a huge part of Mesoamerican culture in pre-Columbian times. They were rich, vibrant cultures, ones that valued art and community with a vastly rich mythology. All of that changed with the arrival and colonization heralded by Cortez and the Spanish. If ever there was a metaphor for what occurred in Central America, here you go. It's called Atahualpa's ransom, and it occurred in Peru. In the 15th century, the Spanish conquistador Pizarro and his men had captured the Inca king Atahualpa and demanded a ransom for his liberty. The Incas stuffed a room with golden idols, glorious relics, anything gold or with gems, basically anything that the Spanish deemed valuable. A lot of these were taken from their temples, they were taken from their burial sites, they were taken from anywhere. One cannot imagine what that room must have looked like. Upon seeing this, Pizarro decreed that all the gold that has been obtained until today and that Atahualpa has given, all this shall be melted and numbered. Save for a few pieces to show back in Spain, the vast majority of these items, the artistry, the tradition, the history, were seen as nothing. They were meaningless. All of it was destroyed and rendered back into raw material. As Claudio Lomnitz observes, since then, the antimony of precious metals and human destitution has been a paradigmatic representation of Spanish America. Mexico was no different than Peru. But what the Mexicans could not keep, these raw materials, they were able to save something miraculously. You see, the Spanish weren't very good at colonialization. The local governments that they installed in Central America were seemingly always broke and undermanned. This was the state of affairs for centuries. The indigenous cultures that Spain supposedly wanted to eradicate were very difficult. Their history and tradition, with seemingly incredibly durable mortuary practices, were a force in and of itself. The 1-2 punch of colonialism and Catholicism as a weapon was not as powerful as the Spanish wished. The Spanish evangelists extirpated the rituals of human sacrifice and home burial, but allowed indigenous theatrical practices of festive mourning. By restricting Corpus Christi and other public celebrations. But Reformation in the 18th century, as well as seeing that they were losing the hearts and minds battle, Day of the Dead was encouraged. Rudderless, colonialists and Catholics, they set up confraternities, also known as cofradias. With sponsorship by the Catholic Church, these very local fraternities were responsible for organizing local festivals and mortuary practices. To my mind, this is the single biggest aspect of Day of the Dead. The Catholic Church handed over the control of these customs to the people of Central America themselves and left them to it. Stay Catholic, they said, walking away. Yeah, sure. As soon as the church's back was turned, countless indigenous traditions came flooding back, sometimes mingling with Catholicism itself. This accounts for the glorious variations in traditions across Mexico, the single greatest thing that draws me there. Is it paganism disguised as Catholicism? What is going on here? It's fucking awesome. Remember what I said earlier with my friend? Remarks about the skeleton being Mexico's totem and it being only for tourists? Well, this is certainly true in some respect. The festival benefited greatly from European and North American tourists seeking a more authentic alternative to the now normal clinical materialist isolation of dying. In the past and to this day, many Mexicans bemoan the Americanization of the holiday, almost a tradition in and of itself that continues still. See Coco and its probably upcoming sequel. The monetary draw of Day of the Dead is staggering, especially for the smaller towns and villages within certain states of Mexico. Would Day of the Dead be anything without the tourists is a question for another time. Of course, all of this is a very gross simplification regarding the history of Dia de los Muertos within Mexico. The experience itself of Day of the Dead, for me, was miserable. As mentioned earlier, it rained the entire time. The person who took us on this journey is a very close personal friend of mine, and after it was all said and done, he admitted that this was definitely the worst Day of the Dead that he has experienced in his 53 years on this planet and living in Mexico. Our journey basically started with 20 of us loading into a bus. And from Morelia, we drove to Santa Fe de la Laguna. Here we enjoyed a homemade stew, and one of the owners of the house that we were staying at for the short period of time explained about his ancestors and his friends and what a lot of rural families go through on Day of the Dead, the veneration of their ancestors. From here we took a bus to our first cemetery, which was Sinsunsan. Now Sinsunsan is known for its ruins as well. They were set up by the Purepecha indigenous culture. The Purepechas were a very interesting group. They never succumbed to the Aztecs, and the Spanish never really completely destroyed their culture, unlike many indigenous cultures. We arrived at Sinsunsan after a great deal of traffic and had to walk a fair distance to get to the graveyard. Now, the graveyard itself was absolutely packed. The amount of people that now attend Day of the Dead is incredible. I think with movies such as Disney's Coco or the last James Bond film Spectre, Day of the Dead is now a big thing for tourists, not just tourists from abroad or from America or Canada or Europe, but in Mexico itself, Day of the Dead is becoming a real event for tons of people. I got to the gates of the cemetery themselves, and it was packed. There were no stanchions to get people going in and going out. It was absolutely rammed. I stood for a period of about 10 minutes merely at the entranceway trying to get in, and this was done to no avail. I went to my friend basically telling him that I'm not making any distance. I can't get in. And he told me, look, go around the side of the cemetery, go all the way up the hill that it's situated on. There are walls all around the cemetery, but you might be able to find another way in. Luckily enough, I did. At the very, very northeast part of the cemetery, there was a small, about 3/4 of a meter space with some stairs that went up. There was a break in the wall, and I went up and I got into the cemetery. When I first got in there, I can't really explain how marvelous it was. The sight of elaborately decorated graves with flowers and food and candles brightly illuminating everything was the thing that I came here for. It was one of the most serene and wonderful things that I've ever experienced. This was what I was here for. This was finally it. And a feeling came over me, some kind of mineral reaction that I can't really explain. I just felt almost as if the breath was being drawn out of me. It was, without parallel, one of the most beautiful things that I've ever experienced. Over some of the graves there would be tarps to, of course, stay dry, as it had been raining for at least 6 hours before we got there. But still there, braving the rain, were tons of residents of Sinsunsan, and they were very jovial, playing instruments, saying prayers, talking to each other. They would take sips of tequila. They almost didn't even know that I was there. I almost was like a ghost amongst the cemetery. I know that sounds extremely cliche, but it's very true. The circumstances of walking around were not the best. My shoes were terrible. They had holes in them, and every time I took a step, it was almost like the holes in the shoes acted as a suction pump and would draw water up into my socks. This was incredibly unpleasant, but the circumstances of the graveyard made me forget about all of this, and I just walked around between the graves. Enjoying is the wrong word. It was something to be experienced. Nothing I had read about beforehand could actually prepare me for it. It was sublime, in a way, understated, but completely austere in its ambitions. The veneration and the respect paid to their ancestors is something that is so completely disarming and almost foreign to most people, and to me especially. I like walking around a good graveyard like everybody, but this was something on a whole different level. This was a joyous occasion. The phrase beyond words is used far too often, but I'm really struggling right now to try and convey just the sights, the smells, the atmosphere itself, the experience that I'm going through, and it seemed perfect. This was what I was finally here for. Unfortunately, we had a schedule to keep, and I was only able to stay in Sinsunsan Cemetery for about 45 minutes, but that 45 minutes will be something that I will never forget. The sneaking into the cemetery, and once getting past the walls to just see the graves on uneven ground with the candles, it renders one almost unable to deal with the beauty. It took me a little while to find the way that I got into the cemetery, but I eventually found it and walked down the hill back to the rest of the group. My friend asked me, "Did you get in?" And I could only say yes. He asked me, "How was it?" I just said it was beautiful, and that was the only word that I could use. That was it. The walk back to the bus was very contemplative for me. I was trying to at least work through some of the feelings and with the expectations that I had going into the cemetery, and from everything that I've read, all of the stories that people have told me about it, it really goes to one of the major reasons that I do magic and at least practice magic and just don't read about it. And it comes up in the quote that I've used before by Ian McGilchrist, the writer of The Master and His Emissary, when he basically says that meaning comes from engagement with the world, not from abstract contemplation of it. My engagement that night, at least in that cemetery, well, I don't know what the meaning is right now at this point. I can kind of have some guesswork, but what I felt and what I experienced was something that was truly magnificent. From Sinsun-san, we took our bus and went back on the road. We were going to head to the island of Pakanda. The trip there was quite terrible. It took about an hour and a half for maybe, I don't know, less than 20 kilometers. That's how much traffic was on the road. As mentioned earlier in the podcast, while I was walking around the cemetery in Sinsun-san, I somehow lost my footing. It didn't completely go down, but I splashed mud mixed with dog shit, and it was all over my pants. So I reeked to high heaven, and being stuck in it's a bus, but it's still a smaller bus with 20 other people while I just stinked like shit. I did not make the best passenger on that bus. I merely just closed my eyes for a little bit, trying to go through in my mind again what I had just seen at Sinsun-san. We get on a boat, and this boat goes to the island of Pakanda, and the boat trip is not very long. Takes very little time, but we get there and disembark, and of course it's just packed when trying to get past people. I eventually kind of jumped over the side of the railings and walked through a bit of forest to be able to get to the path that would lead to the cemetery. This cemetery was somewhat smaller, but even still there was the reverence for the ancestors that I experienced in Sinsun-san. But a lot of the graves' candles were put out due to the lack of tarps that were there. The rain had extinguished all of them. Spending about an hour there, we slowly walk back to the boat, get on the boat, and make the trek back. Getting back on the bus, I'm still very miserable, and I still stink like shit. We begin the slow bus ride back to Morelia. I didn't arrive back until about 6:30 in the morning. We had set out at 7 at night the day before, November 1st, and we arrived back at 6:30. It was nearly a full day, night unto itself. As horrible as I make it sound, I think that it was an experience that I needed to go through. So now I know what I don't want for the next time I go to Dia de los Muertos. I would say for people that want to experience it for themselves, go in a small car and do not go in a group. Try to find your way to some of the smaller towns in and around Pátzcuaro. Try to stay away from Pátzcuaro completely. There are smaller towns in and around the area where they will observe Dia de los Muertos as much as these larger towns will. When I do it the next time, this will definitely be the way that I do it. And yeah, I would suggest for most people to try and stick to this as well. The very first question that I was asked by a guest in the pre-show quid pro quo was, how often do you think about death? And my answer was, quite often. And that is not a hyperbole, and that is not an exaggeration. I am obsessed with death. I know this might sound very macabre or morbid, but no, my brain is constantly fixated on mortality and the end of what is the material body. I think that this is a somewhat healthy thing. I think that people don't think about death as much as they should. For many people, they would think, well, just to dwell on death is unhealthy. Not everything is about some kind of end of existence for me. I see death in a very healthy way. I lived a great majority of my life scared of death. In some way, the magic that I do now and the work that I have done through enchanting my life has helped me greatly in realizing that there really is nothing to fear from death at all. Losing the fear of death is incredibly important. It was to me, but I think that as long as you're able to lose your fear of death, you're almost invincible. I think it kind of goes without saying that other cultures outside of what we call the West do ancestors and work with ancestor spirits far better than we do here. As this is a show for people curious or wanting to get into magic, I think I need to offer a tip or two, and there's only going to be one major one that I give this episode, and that is, if you're just starting out in magic, you need to have an ancestral altar. Now what that is a small place, either a windowsill or on a small table, adorned with things that belonged to your ancestor, will remind you of your ancestors and people that you knew, family members more so than others. But friends can be there as well. I know a lot of people have lost friends. Get yourself a nice cloth to put down. Have pictures of your ancestors, specifically the good ones. If you had a really shitty ancestor or a family member that you knew that while they were alive or even before you were alive that didn't really do very good things, I would not suggest having them on your altar. Remember, you get to choose who you put on your altar and who you want to offer respect to. Remember, respect is earned. It's not automatic. Make sure it's nice and tidy, always. A little dust can accumulate, there's nothing wrong with that, but try to keep it clean. Put some fresh flowers down. Candles, essential. Incense, absolutely. Always have water available for your altar, specifically spring water. As I've said this before, spring water comes from the ground, and that's where we put the dead people. They seem to like it, and I always have spring water about for such things. If there are any snacks that your ancestors like, then those go on there as well. If the water evaporates, that's probably for the best, but if you're putting food items on the altar, again, keep it clean. Make it something that the spirits would definitely like. If you're starting out in magic, this is maybe one of the first things that you should do. Maybe even before sigils or any kind of spell casting, get yourself an ancestral altar. And I don't even think magicians should be the only ones that have this. I think that we should all have these kind of things. So yes, an ancestral altar for both kin and kind. If you want to go further with it, there are ways and prayers and incantations and whatnot that you can do with your ancestral altar. The sky's the limit with this kind of things, but get the spirits of the people that you knew or were fairly familiar with. It's somewhat strange, but one of the people that I'm closest with spiritually is my grandfather on my mother's side. His name was Philip. He died years before I was born. It's very bizarre for my family because in a lot of ways I'm almost nearly a carbon copy of him. My mother, my grandmother, his wife, who is still alive to this day, as well as my aunt, would often walk behind me as we were going somewhere to see me walk, because apparently I walk exactly like the way that Philip does. A lot of my interests were his interests as well. I remember my mom being somewhat taken aback when I for some reason picked up a very specific kind of cookie for her to buy when I was younger, and she asked, "Why are you bringing this up?" And I said, "Well, I just felt like I want these." And she said, "Did you know that this was your grandfather Philip's favorite snack to eat?" It's strange how the ancestors that you don't know affect you. But please realize this. The dead listen. They are part of you. Past, present, and future. Really, all they want is your acknowledgement, some time, and of course, a remembrance. That's not too much to ask. At around 6:45 in the morning, November 2nd, my experience physically was over. My journey was over. But being the magician that I am, I laid in bed on my back that morning and was trying to see if I could feel anything. I was trying to see if there was anything that I could glean from the other side, perhaps. I laid there and I entered into a trance. It's somewhat easy for me. This was not a hypnagogic state. I tend to do that during the day, but I entered into a trance and just to see if I could tune in anything. I just let things come to me. This is a skill that I think that magicians should try to have. It's a very important skill, I think. It took maybe 15 to 20 minutes. Again, I might have just been exhausted. I might be very tired. The experience was a interesting one, but definitely something came through. I was lying there, and I heard the voices of children, many children speaking Spanish, and they sounded so joyful. They sounded so happy, and I kept listening. Over top of them, somewhat closer to me, I heard the voices of women talking, and they were talking amongst each other, and they sounded very content. And God, I wish I knew Spanish so I could understand what they were saying. But this sound and their voices were so clear to me. It gives me a great amount of hope for what happens to us after death. Death is not the end of you. You need to figure out your eschatology. That is what you think happens after death. Now, I'm not going to regale you with what I think happens. I think if you've listened to this episode so far, I think you can kind of guess as to what I think occurs. But I ask that perhaps that you start to confront these concepts and start to make them a bit more apparent in your life. Give death the mental work that it deserves. When I started this episode, I started with, where is my place in the world? And I don't think it's Mexico. It's close. But maybe anywhere that the spirits and the dead congregate, that might be my place in the world, where they're a little bit closer to the surface. But I have the spirits join with me almost everywhere. I've made my place in the world whichever place I happen to be, which I think is very healthy. It seems to work for me, and I hope that when the inevitable happens and I join the majority, that my place remains everywhere still, and that there will be more living souls like me that spare me a thought, a candle, and perhaps a snack while I continue with my journey. My name is Douglas Batchelor, and you've been listening to a somewhat personal episode of What Magic Is This? Head to whatmagicisthis.com. There you will find links to Twitter, to Instagram, and to Facebook. Also there, you'll find show notes for each episode. On this website as well, you can find links on how to download the show on iTunes, on Stitcher, on Spotify, on TuneIn, on Radio Public, on iHeartRadio, on Google Play, on YouTube, and many, many more. If they've got podcasts, I'll be there. If you could be so kind and leave a rating for my podcast on iTunes or Stitcher or Spotify, that would be greatly appreciated. Feel free to email me on any of these platforms. I will respond. I'm very good at that kind of thing. I want to thank you all for listening and being patient with me on this episode. Thank you all so much for your time. You've only got so much of it left, right? And we'll talk at you soon. Bye-bye.